Svana took up the scroll and wound the wooden spools to read. Objective imagination. Conclusion. Basis of sustenance. Physical resource. The body of the entity is the physical vehicle by which the entity interacts in the manifested environment. It is a part of the manifested environment. It grows from it and requires it for sustenance. The body's functional form develops long before the mind awakens to reflectively govern the body's use. Until then, it must develop in complexity over time. In that time, it evolves to form according to the requirements of its environment in the securing of provisioning relationships. To survive in the environment is to compete for resources and to be resilient to the hardship that innate existence entails. It means the physical resilience to survive through the inherent and immediate experience of actual and direct existential challenge. It means the maintenance of strength through the securing of sufficient nutrition and through the meeting and overcoming of adversity and the protection of access to the resources that are required for survival. For the individual innate entity, in the context of like organisms, survival proves to require strict adherence to proven pattern. However, in order to develop reflective capacity, the body must not simply meet the requirements of basic survival, it must excel in meeting the requirements. Basis of sustenance. Intellectual resource. The mind of the entity develops to give voice to developed complexity of body. First, it arises to help guide the body in its survival. Then it develops to secure its survival in the immediate through manipulation of the provisional environment to its interest. At this base stage of cognitive development, the manipulative ability develops in the absence of full recognition of the complexity of the totality of its environment, and thus without the sensitivity to replace the innate governing mechanism inherent in the balance of the environment with a sufficiently capable alternative. Yet, in response to conflict, and in the course of manipulative development, the mind develops a rational capacity to appreciate the necessity for governance in the context of interest in maintaining or discouraging specific developed intents. Where the mind is successful, it secures its position sufficiently to allow the extension of its consideration to abstract possibility and to objective potential. To achieve this state of capability, it must be maintained, like the body, in strength and resilience. Of all accessible content, it must be fed that which is most able to bolster its ability to consider increasingly complex orders of understanding. Basis of sustenance. Intuitive resource. Once the mind has sufficiently secured not just the survival of the body, but also the longevity of the body, and once it has on that basis sufficiently developed its rational capacity through the consideration of factors and pattern of physical and intellective manifestation, it may attend itself to the consideration of abstracted objective understanding. With efficient consideration of objective understanding, the entity may begin to comprehend a system of guidance according to which it may direct its body and its intellective effort towards magnified potential. For this purpose, the intellect employs objective imagination. Objective imagination is the employment of the imagination in the determination of objective form and the applicable underlying principles necessarily embodied in the achieving of the form. In this process, the intuitive resource connects the mind to the underlying intent of the provisioning environment. In comprehending the will of that intent to manifest total potential, the entity, in reaching towards its own potential, must seek to internalize the utmost conceptualized value of absolute infinity that it is able to conceive. Growth of perspective, empathy. The development of empathetic comprehension is the development of the extension of emotive consideration to external entities. Base levels of empathetic understanding arise in the interrelation of supporting entities in the innate environment. The sense of the other derives from the shared experience and mutual reliance experienced in the securing of survival. Empathetic consideration applies not only to loyalty in the context of interrelation, it also applies to the development of language through the development of shared evolution. It develops from familiarity with patterns of behavior at the innate level, from the experienced ability to work together as a single group enterprise in the face of threats, and from the familiarity developed in all aspects of the entity to all others in its innate collective. The innate empathetic sensitivity represents a level of communication that develops long before spoken language. Empathy in the communication of body through instinctual and inherent emotive response is the means by which understanding can be achieved as if without communication. It is, in its deepest state, the embodiment of direct communication between individual entities. Growth of perspective, locality of harm. Locality of harm is a development of the empathetic comprehension to the point of the internalization of external experience for purposes of directed internal growth. Where empathetic sensitivity is directed beyond the immediate innate interrelation, it may be applied to constructs developed through rationally directed imagination to a more extensive field of manifested experience. This adjustment of input is necessary if the entity is to gain the sensitivity necessary to determine a wider context in which to consider its own parameters of consideration. By extending beyond the experience of its immediate innate reliance, it may determine the position of its own innate collective on an objective scale as well as a subjective scale. Through localization of harm, the entity internalizes the realization of the cost of its own subjective intent and the potential or actualized cost of collective subjective intent, so as to determine the rational attribution of costs, where attribution is configured without regard to loyalty based in familiarity and without regard for threat to its own subjective interest. Growth of perspective, objective perspective. Objective perspective is the development of the internalization of empathetic comprehension from the localized manifested experience to abstractly manifested objective principles. Objective perspective grows from the development of the ability to localize harm according to rationally directed extension of empathetic sensitivity. Whereas localization of harm is sufficient for the rational attribution of responsibility in the subjective context, it applies only to the extended local environment of the entity. Through application to objective principle, the entity establishes a motive sensitivity that is calibrated to parameters that hold the potential to provide bases of consideration that pertain directly to the entity's choice in manipulation of its environment. As the entity establishes familiarity with the patterns that govern the existence it wishes to emulate and embody, and by establishing goals that extend beyond its known manifestation, it may hold confidence in its path regardless of the application of life or death. Executing development, strategic networks. The development of innate direct communication through empathetic sensitivity within the group allows the development of networks of reliance within the content of the innate provisioning environment. By developing recognition of the ability for coordination through shared language, the network of reliant entities may begin to strategically employ various individual intents towards collective interests. This ability allows an increase in efficiency in the securing of a necessary provision and an increase in competence in developing resilience against threat to the mutual collective interest. Where the network is most successful, it allows the collective to secure its position within its environment to an extent where internal threat arises. This internal threat is the subversion of primary need by subjective desire. Where subjective threat manifests in the collective, it must be governed if cost to the provisioning environment and to the ability for the objective pursuit are to be avoided. Executing development, considered investment. With the recognition of the threat resulting from the development of security through the success of strategic networks, the entity must employ resolve of intellect to consider potential for investment outside of its local subjective consideration. This ability reconfigures emotive loyalty to appreciate the benefit of achieving sustenance without causing needless cost. Needless cost is cost that results from misguided development taking place simply as a result of capability for growth regardless of innate or objective need. Through considered investment, the individual entity allows its power of intent to be employed in a way that increases the value of the collective environment, despite the possibility of that shift coming at a cost to the more familiar and more immediately local environment and its attendant entities. Considered investment is to realize that the value of internalizing the need for broader balance outweighs in value the loss of the closer connection, where the closer connection is positioned to unjustifiably externalize costs to the broader environment. Executing development, sustainable governance. Sustainable governance may develop where the entity, in developing awareness of objective need, internalizes principles consistent with the objective intent. Through development at the individual level of internalized principle, the entity acts according to an appreciation for the need to develop according to objective principle in order to sustain the provisioning environment for purposes of securing availability of necessary resources. These necessary resources are the physical, nutritional, and protective resources for the body, intellective resources that provide the mind an integrated system by which to mirror its own interactive breadth of experience, and spiritual resources in the provision of an expression of varying degrees of infinitude that may act as a basis of objective comprehension of underlying principle. By engaging in sustainable internal governance, according to objective principle, the entity transcends any necessity for external regulation and may develop itself towards its potential in concert with others that have realized an equivalent stage. Managing the system. Harmonization of intent. The recognition of proven pattern and the development of interrelation through empathetic consideration allows the development of strategic networks. These strategic networks serve to more efficiently procure provision. They also serve to strengthen individual resilience by allowing the application of the emotive response at the collective level to be used as a resource for the individual. As the benefit is directly apparent at the innate level, and due to the directness of an interrelation at that level, the entity is inherently drawn into the prevailing pattern, or it fails. Through this necessity in the innate context, harmonization of intent linked to collective interest arises. The collective in this case is all that is empathetically tied through evolved experience. The network evolves to manage itself automatically as a result of inherently established mutual interest. Where intent held and exhibited does not harmonize in the innate context, it exposes itself to heightened risk. Except in the extreme case, this gives rise to an unsupportable increase in the probability of failure. As the entities that fail to harmonize fall away, their contrary intent fails to evolve through sufficient reproduction. Also, those within the collective that perceive the failure realize it through their direct empathetic consideration and thus are reinforced in their interest towards the value of harmonization. Managing the system. Embracing uncertainty. Through the development of intellective ability and the extension of empathetic consideration to non-local consideration, in order to develop parameters that take into account a more extended understanding of the cost of intent in the wider environment and the realization of extended causal chains, the entity is encouraged to step outside of its immediate innate security. To make this step, the entity must embrace the uncertainty of shifting its allegiance of influence further to the rational within the extended environment. This step requires the entity to transcend its inherent investment in its innate sense of reliance. Embracing this uncertainty allows the entity to transcend in its awareness the subjective intent of the collective of which it is a part. This transcendence is the first step towards manifestation of objective intent and consists of the development of governance towards rational principle regardless of apparent prevailing subjective intent. It constitutes the realization of the need to transcend the state in which the intellect is maintained and employed solely for purposes of survival according to innate emotive requirements that reflect the base survival intent of the body if the entity is to continue to reach for its potential. Managing the system. Sustainable regulation. Sustainable regulation is the internalized regulation of the entity resulting from its focus on objective principle and adherence to the form of that manifestation in order to achieve the value of its state. Sustainable regulation thus is embodied through the active direction of purpose according to abstract parameters brought into local consciousness through the application of objective imagination. In applying the rational faculty towards the embodiment of form consistent with abstract principle, the mind fuels a driving intent that requires the extension of emotive sensitivity be calibrated according to the objective state sought to be embodied. Where entities are able to achieve this state collectively, there is no need for mutual regulation. As in the case of the innate state, adherence is inherent as a result of the integrity and consistency of intent. But it is different from the innate state in that it develops to manifest heightened potential of purpose, not only through the securing of the innate need, but also through the avoidance of subjective cost. The realized development that may then be achieved reflects ever-increasing localized appreciation for states representing increasing orders of infinitude. Only through internalization at the individual level can the collective state be achieved where all entities act in concert towards the costless goal of the realization of absolute infinity without the need for coercion.